Landscape architecture is an important part of the museum's mission to educate the public about the built environment and its impact on our lives. From grand parks to complete streetscapes, residential gardens to sustainable landscapes, landscape architects design places where life's activities can happen between the buildings. As urban centers gain more population, the pressure to provide open public spaces to recreate, relax, or play has grown. Some of these burgeoning cities include public landscapes from the 60s and 70s that could offer more contemporary ideas regarding the open space necessary for vital city life. So how do we incorporate these modernist landscapes into today's urban environments, or should we? Those are the questions at the heart of tonight's discussion. This evening's program is presented in partnership with the National Capital Planning Commission. To say a few words about the Commission and to introduce our distinguished panelists and moderator, we're honored to welcome Preston Bryant, Chairman of the National Capital Planning Commission. President Obama appointed Mr. Bryant as Chairman of NCPC in September of 2009. Mr. Bryant is a Senior Vice President for Economic and Infrastructure Development in the Richmond office of McGuire Woods Consulting, where he advises on a wide range of issues, including water and wastewater facilities, conventional and renewable energy, and commercial and industrial development. Mr. Bryant previously served as Secretary of Natural Resources in the cabinet of former Virginia Governor Timothy Kane, where he oversaw the Commonwealth's environmental, recreational, wildlife, and historic resource agencies. Prior to his cabinet service, Secretary Bryant served in the Virginia House of Delegates for 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Preston Bryant.
Good evening. This is a terrific crowd. We're so glad that you are here. I am Preston Bryant, and I have the privilege of chairing the National Capital Planning Commission. And as Chase said, the National Capital Planning Commission is the central planning agency for all U.S. government-owned lands and buildings in the 2,500 square mile national capital region, so the Washington, D.C. and its Maryland and Virginia environs. So if you're to do an improvement to any building or any land, whether it's the National Mall or the White House grounds or Rock Creek Park or the National Zoo or any office building, we would be happy to help you with those plans. First, let me say a bit of gratitude to Julia Koster with NCPC, who, in working with the National Building Museum, helped plan this evening's program. And I also am pleased to be joined by two of our commissioners, Peter May and Tom Gallus, who are here this evening. We're excited to be here tonight to discuss what is a topical issue. While preservation and revitalization of modernist buildings has been widely covered in recent years, modernist landscapes and public spaces have not been discussed as extensively. And as we know, Washington has a number of important modernist landscapes and public spaces. Many of them are federally managed. These include works by notable design professionals such as Dan Kiley, I.M. Pei, Orvaldo Casuda, Paul Friedberg, and Lawrence Halprin. The original metro entrances and stations designed by Harry Weiss might arguably be on this list as well. So as the federal government's planning agency in Washington, the National Capital Planning Commission is one of several stewards of the capital's abundant historic and cultural resources. So we want to explore and understand how 20th century modernist urban landscapes can or should respond to contemporary expectations. And our speakers tonight will help us understand the original context informing these designs and discuss ideas on how to sensitively honor and adapt these landscapes using expectations and experiences from other cities. So with that, thank you all for coming this evening, and I would like to call up Brad McKee, who is the editor of Landscape Architecture magazine.
Hi everybody, welcome and good evening. It's so nice to see such a large turnout tonight. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank our friends at the National Capital Planning Commission for putting this program together tonight, as well as the National Building Museum. I strongly believe that we are very fortunate in the city to have such two strong and dedicated advocates and stewards for the built environment in our midst, and that makes us unique among American cities. Tonight's program is about advocacy and stewardship. It is, of course, called Modernist Landscapes Reconsidered. We have two of the finest thinkers in landscape architecture to hear from tonight and help shape our understanding. We're going to hear first from Gary Hilderbrand, who's a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and a principal at the firm of Reed Hilderbrand in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Besides having designed, along with his partner Douglas Reed, some of the most mesmerizing built landscapes you'll ever see in town or country, many of which have won awards from ASLA and others, Gary has taught legions of students at the GSD the imperatives of transforming urban and other environments with designs that are poetic and high-performing. He's also a marvelous writer, and one of my favorite things about Gary is that he is a champion of urban forestry. After Gary, we're going to hear from the incomparable Elizabeth Meyer, who is the Merrill D. Peterson Professor of Landscape Architecture in the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia, where she teaches graduate design studios and theory. Beth is a landscape architect who has practiced at the firms Edaw, Hannah Olin, and the office of Michael Ferguson. Until recently, Beth served for a period as the Dean of the School of Architecture and has served as the chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at UVA. She's known throughout the field for her theoretical writings on what she calls the entanglement, a word I like very much, of modern conceptions of experiences of nature, environmental ethics, and contemporary landscape design. We're also proud to have Beth here in Washington, seated as the Vice Chairman of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, another eminent body that acts as a guardian of design in our federal city and of design that serves the federal interest. They're housed right upstairs. Both Gary and Beth are ideally situated to address this topic of reconsidering modern landscapes. These landscapes and the disputes that come up around them frequently take a lot of us by surprise in places where they exist. I'd say it's fair to say tonight that we're focusing generally on landscapes of the post-war era, and particularly I think it's important to highlight landscapes built since the mid-1960s. And the reasons for that are numerous. One is there are statutory reasons why this particular period of landscapes come into question of alteration or even demolition. Most of them, to start, are not yet eligible for the National Register of Historic Places or for status as National Historic Landmarks. So that leaves absent a layer of protection that they might otherwise have. Another reason they're threatened is because many people, frankly, upon seeing one, just don't know what they're looking at. I would venture to say that often that which is recent has a disadvantage over perhaps older stuff or newer stuff because it may strike people as too familiar to need protection. The genuine article of modernist design could be easily confused by casual observers as one of its many derivatives, which are not quite done so well. So as we have seen numerous times and again, a site's problem may not be its design, it may more likely be its maintenance. We visited a couple of sites this afternoon, significant sites here in Washington, where this is the definite problem. We went to the Banneker Overlook in Southwest DC, near L'Enfant Plaza, and then we went to Pershing Park near the Treasury Building, between it and Freedom Plaza on Pennsylvania Avenue. And we also walked down the stretch of Pennsylvania, almost, about halfway to the Capitol from the White House, another landscape for which new questions are being asked. And lastly, but by no means finally, an important site may be in the way of something that a developer or a politician, for instance, may consider more important, and that something usually involves a large financial stake. So as Chase pointed out earlier, cities are changing rapidly as people swarm back in to live in them. Needs are changing, preferences are changing. But I want to bring back the words of the late Diana Balmori, the great landscape architect, from when she was on the Commission of Fine Arts. She was at the time bending over backwards before a panel that was made up largely otherwise of architects to save a landscape here in Washington that they were just going to build a bunch of condos on. The landscape was by the great Ellen Biddle Shipman. And among Diana's pleas to this group was this, that she reminded the other commissioners that architecture enjoys so many different forms of protection and that landscape has relatively few. And those of us who work around the landscape profession know this. I don't know how otherwise she twisted the arms of her colleagues, but she got her way, and that landscape is now the marvelous Treguarren Park up by the National Zoo in Woodley Park here in Washington. So please consider that as we hear from Gary and Beth. We're not really here to argue at the poles of demolition versus strict preservation, or what I call pickling. We're here to talk about how to preserve the essential characteristics that keep important landscapes living, which is, after all, their great distinction that they are indeed alive. After Gary and Beth speak, I'm going to open a discussion with them, but we are going to move quickly to take questions from you in the audience. There are cards available that are going to be circulating on which you can write your questions or your comments, and there will be folks walking around to collect those cards. Pass them to us in the front so we can air what you have to say. So with that, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Gary Hilderbrand. Thank you.
I'm particularly honored to share the stage with these two close friends and two people I admire a lot. And I also want to thank the staff and the commission for a thoughtful tour that we had today. Brad mentioned, I think, which prepared us well for this evening. I want to acknowledge at the outset that my awareness of design as a kid in the 1960s in the Hudson Valley came largely from visits to New York City, where I could visit museums and galleries, 6th Avenue, Central Park, and that my ensuing deep passion for art and design in all their material manifestations came about during the period of late modernism, post-war modernism, as Brad said. And I say this because that colors my talk tonight, for sure. And it has shaped my entire education and my career in landscape architecture, and it has shaped the work of our firm. The abstraction and the expressive power of 20th century painting, sculpture, fabric, furniture, music, dance, architecture, and the city all color my world and undergird how we in practice think through problems abstractly and conceptually. So I come to you this evening as a modernist who loves what modernism has brought to our world. Not all of it, though, for sure. In fact, in our North American cities, we could say, sadly, there's often been more harm than good in the post-war period. But I can talk about two significant projects tonight because I'm really taken with them. I'm a student of them. And because I've had the interesting fortune to work on both as a designer long after their initial creation. Here are the two case studies. Christian Science Plaza in Boston, built from 1968 to 1972, and another Boston project that emerged during the same period, Boston City Hall and the City Hall Plaza. These are whoppers in the annals of mid-century modernist projects. Much loved, sometimes hated, and in the case of City Hall Plaza, still greatly maligned and downright horrible in the view of a lot of people. In our first conversation about this forum, facing up to questions of original design intention, in the district's modernist landscape projects as they come in for review. And some of these cases are extremely well known and they generate national press. They wondered broadly how the interpretation of original design intent informs preservation strategies or guides design interventions in practice. I think it's pretty hard to generalize on this topic, so I'm pleased that my task here tonight is to use two examples from practice and from elsewhere, not from here, not from the district, not from the Monumental Corps. Because we want to make these talks brief and get to the dialogue, I'm going to short-circuit both of these stories a bit. Each of these could be a long talk in itself. I do want to say something about monumentality, because monumentality is at the heart of both of the case studies tonight. And I'm using the old State House in Boston as an example of the way that a building in 1713 could be monumental, all the way on the left, could change its face a lot over the generations, and where its own monumentality would be overcome by the city surrounding it. Just an interesting kind of way of thinking about monumentality. And the second general point I want to make is that landscapes change a lot. Brad described them as living, as alive. And maybe no better example than the National Mall. You could have Downing's version of the mall on the left, or Frederick Law Olmsted's version, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr.'s version, or you could have the Obama version, and you could have the Trump version. We all work with conjecture, and sometimes we work with facts. Couldn't pass it up. I love this view of Boston City Hall by Steve Rosenthal in 1974, 6 years after completion of City Hall and its plaza. It captures, for me, the monumentality that was intended here. And the architects thought that in the post-war city, one of the ways we could recuperate the city was by building monuments, building monumentality. And just take a look at this photograph. Maybe most of you know the City Hall and its plaza. Look at how this captures Faneuil Hall, one of the first public buildings in the United States, and the place where democracy was really heralded in the very early days. How the brick of the plaza turns into the surface of the building. How the stairs up to the ceremonial parts of City Hall read as if they are available to you on the plaza. The architects, Gerhard Kallman and Michael McKinnell, were teachers and theorists, and this is one of their first buildings. And I believe theirs was an optimistic view that the role of government in our lives should be present, should be expressed in the building. Well, it was an important building for a while. The plaza, pretty tough place, and I'll explain more about that. Here's one of the reasons why this place is not loved by a lot of people. This is IMP's master plan for the government center. And the City Hall is, of course, at the center of this. The idea behind this plan was clearing the city and building through monumentality a place where the city government, functions of the state government, and functions of the federal government convened in the government center, and that the cleared floor of the city was the connective fabric that would make this come alive. They believed this very sincerely. Boston had been, for probably half a century, a corrupt place without much building, deteriorating rapidly. This is an advertisement in the New York Times supplement, the magazine, pitching a new Boston. And it's really true that the mayors, the successive mayors, Collins and Hines, would see the government center as a recuperative device for announcing to the world that Boston would get back on its feet. That's the set of blocks they cleared in order to do this. And the sins of that time are not lost on us today. This is about disinvestment, redlining, moving people out, and then building a new city. Vast amount of clearing. And very large buildings. See anything you recognize? This is the plan of the government center after the competition that was won by Coleman, McKinnell, and Knowles. It's a little hard to read, so I'll pass on here, but one of the problems is that these buildings were simply too large. Now, we have to give the architects credit for the way they thought of this building. This is a cross-section which shows Faneuil Hall and the floor of the city passing through the building. This is the federal building designed by Walter Gropius and Tack. And Michael McKinnell's quote here is relevant. The building should be open and penetrable and accessible night and day, and that was the whole idea of passing through and under the building. Transparent, they thought. And, you know, in some moments you might be able to believe that, the invitation of this at night. And by the way, there is lots of discussion throughout the last decades of the monumentality in relationship to the history of European architecture. Le Corbusier's La Tourette there, a kind of model for these architects. This building didn't meet the ground well in a lot of places, and so while the idea of transparency seemed real, these saddlebags really didn't own up to that, didn't follow through. And in general, that master plan of a cleared site with lots of big new building, a big announcement of a rebirth in Boston, in fact gave us buildings that were too large and spaces that were too vast. There is lots of talk about the relationship of the Piazza del Campo in Siena as a model for the City Hall Plaza. I think they believed that the vast plaza would be the host of civic events, and in fact it was for a long time. This is one of the mayors, Mayor Raymond Flynn, who disliked City Hall and started it on a path of poor stewardship. But it worked pretty well for events like this. This is probably a Celtics celebration. There might be one there tonight. It's hard to miss a Game 7. This can no longer happen in City Hall Plaza. If the Celtics beat Cleveland, then the event that used to look like this will be a moving event because we no longer have 40,000 people in one place in Boston. It doesn't happen. So in many ways, this plaza doesn't work the way it was intended. And this was, just a few years back, a campaign led by the mayor, at the time Thomas Menino, another mayor who disliked City Hall, essentially wanted to get rid of it, sell it off, build a new one. And there was a wonderful effort to save City Hall as well. Our current mayor, who has commissioned the work that we are doing, was depicted here during his campaign as having made City Hall our front yard. And apparently, the idea was that we could have soccer and Poseidon, and that those would be recuperative. So they had an ideas competition, and when you do that, as is well known in Washington, you get a lot of stuff that isn't believable, like soccer fields on City Hall Plaza. I can guarantee you that cannot happen. Can't be done. The outcome really was about $650 worth of AstroTurf, some chairs, and a big chess set. But we are really working on something now. This plaza is broken. It's really in difficult shape, as this photograph from about 4 years ago depicts. Now, just a little bit about our work. I'm not really able to show a lot of it, and one or two of these slides will appear for a very short time, because the project hasn't really gotten a public reception yet. This depicts the way that the architects originally thought about the building and the plaza. The bureaucrats at the top, the expressive parts in the middle, the mayor's office goes all the way through, the city council, mayor's office pokes out here, and the mayor's office stares at Faneuil Hall in a kind of beautifully poetic relationship of our past in governance to the present. And Mayor Kevin White, who was the first mayor to occupy this building, really believed this. And so this is how the original intention suggested that the building be organized. Public levels, the first three, symbolic level, and then administrative. This is what we are planning to do, to bring all the meeting rooms that are up here in various departments down to the plaza level, and to poke very big holes in those brick saddlebags. That's not going to go over well with a bunch of people, but the mayor is getting behind this idea. Here's another diagram that shows the way we can now think about reorganizing the plaza to truly do what the architects originally intended, which is to flow into the building, so that all of this would be publicly accessed spaces. Our relationship to government has changed, but we still have interactions all the time. If you present, as designers do here at the Fine Arts Commission or at NCPC, in Boston you go in a back door, down a narrow corridor, and up a service elevator. This will all change, and the city is committing to moving all of that public function to the plaza level, and we believe that will enliven the plaza. So we're talking about very major interventions. Now, it's not as easy as I say. This is the original drawing of Coleman McKinnell, which I believe is about the thesis that the continuous floor of the city flows into the building. This is what we're basing our proposed interventions on. And it's a lovely drawing. And it's also a complex system. So when you look at this very closely, you realize that the architects were in fact maniacal about the geometries resolving for different areas of the plaza. We're talking about 26 feet of grade change across that space. And these geometries are about organizing the field condition of the plaza, high up along here and sloping down with something like 1,000 steps. This is a diagram that shows that there are about 9 different kinds of joints in the brick pattern. This is a very sophisticated and complex thing. And this is a diagram with the black dots that show how each of these little areas are drained. We can't drain a plaza like that today. And so here we're going to take some very big leaps and rethink the way the surface is organized without losing the idea of the continuous surface of the city. And this is a diagram which begins to show some of that. And we are going to add 100 trees to the plaza. And the rationale there is that it's too vast, we all know it. We can make a serious addition to the plaza without losing that continuous floor of the city idea. And we can increase the shade cover from about 9% or 10% to 30% by doing so. We can organize and manage and treat stormwater differently. We're really talking about a very different way of thinking there. And we have to get people to the door in ways that the Americans for Disabilities Act declares is our obligation. And so we are making quite a lot of change there, removing a whole platform in that location and rebuilding steps in ways that can be negotiated by nearly everybody. Okay, this one's going to be quick. It's going to be green someday. And we think it's going to, in doing so, it's going to return to some of the original intentions. One last word about the City Hall. The bicentennial list from the American Institute of Architects of the best buildings in the United States had Boston City Hall tied for 6th place with Richardson's Trinity Church. It has gone from being very significantly praised to being at a real low point. And it's our duty to take it back. And imagine this from Sybil Moholy-Nagy, a quote, "Like Boston Common, it will be copied and repeated in old cities." You think of the Forrestal Center. As Brad said, the copies are often not as good as the originals. Think of the Hoover Building. "It will be copied and repeated in old cities, seeking new life and in new cities rising. There is nothing like it in America, nothing half so good." Critics aren't always right. Boston is now unique among American cities. It has recaptured its past in the very nick of time. It has created a giant plaza in many felicitous levels that rivals Venice and Rome. These are pretty tall claims. Suitable to its climate, not so, and to the use of single individuals or great concourses of people. It goes on. When this is achieved, and it's achieved rarely, Athens, Venice, Chartres, Rome, there time stops. Ages unborn will hold it in remembrance. Well, let's see if we can get it back to that place. I would say in the pantheon of big modernist interventions on cleared sites, there are not many good ones, but the Christian Science Plaza stands out as singularly great. Let me tell you about an anecdote, though. When Doug Reed and I were invited, we had almost no history of urban work. We were invited to look at this plaza for rehabilitation 18 years ago. We went to our first workshop. We had always loved this place and thought it was amazing, and we couldn't believe that we would get such a commission. What we learned in a workshop with church leadership and staff was that they didn't think it was very good at all, and they really wanted it changed. And it was a little bit hard to take. I think this is a kind of poignant example of a mismatch between design intentions and people's apprehension of where they are. Brad, you said it so beautifully. Sometimes people just don't recognize what they see. So this is the original Mother Church, built in 1896 on a small block in the middle of Boston. And I love this. This is the Mother Church and its extension, as it was called. So, and that's 1906. So, you know, in a little bit more than a decade, they really were feeling their oats. And I think, talk about monumentality. They were thinking about building monuments. That's Charles Brigham doing the addition in 1906, the extension rather. And this slide just 20 years after that shows, more ambition in a building there and in the publishing house building here, kind of a beautiful metropolitan building, and a garden, a big garden. I'll explain the red lines in a little bit. So they were, really building, I think they never liked the reference to the Vatican, but they were building really a very monumental space in the city, and there would be even more monumentality yet to come. And it's just hard to see these, but there you see the site before clearing and then afterwards. And, these were all blocks that were redlined and removed, 14 acres of removal of the city. And then you can see the imprint of the plaza as it was completed. Boston had the idea that there was the downtown beginning to rise with high rises, and that there would be something that Kevin Lynch and others called the high spine. And the Christian Science Plaza included a 300-foot tall building, 25 stories, as a part of that idea of the high spine. Now, this is a photograph taken not long after the completion of the plaza, and you just maybe couldn't find a more beautiful example, in my view, of a place that had been completely impacted by blocks and had to be discovered going down the street, to something with a very grand gesture of monumentality and this amazing 700-foot-long reflecting pool holding the middle, each building in its place. And I think something that's quite interesting, entrances that barely announce themselves in the colonnade building, in the administration building, in the what was called the Sunday school. And this is a plan by Sasaki, Dawson, and DeMay. Stuart Dawson and several other guys, Jerry Venable, worked on this with Araldo Kasuda, mainly from Pei's office. And you can see the abstraction here, the kind of insistent geometry. Here's another view just after completion. Now, the characteristic of this plaza that interests me the most, and it really took working on it for probably a year or more to truly understand it, was that this was built as a place where the worshipers on Wednesdays and Sundays could drive in and park. They could even drive down along the reflecting pool and around, guided by the white stone, and into the parking garage there. And this was a proposition that we could mix cars and people in the same space, something that we recognize happens all the time in Europe. This worked for only a very short time, actually didn't work, and the tiny little curbs were eventually removed. But I loved the kind of beautiful tension of this line, which is drawn around the plaza like a cord, tying all of the elements together. It's a lovely design. You can see it here as well. So that on Sunday mornings you would see this parked with cars and they would be circulating around through there. Well, we can't really mix cars and people well, can we? A reference to one of the important precedents that Pei and Kasuda had in mind here. This is Le Corbusier again, Chandigarh. And this is a view which shows the attitude toward landscape here, which was disciplined and measured and extremely careful geometry. And even the idea of seasonality was a completely controlled geometry of annuals. When we were completing our work on the Plaza rehabilitation, we discovered that the original intention of this wasn't as an aerial hedge. Stuart Dawson told me this himself. And so one of the things we did was simply a management strategy of recuperating these trees, elevating their canopies so that there was in fact some transparency to Huntington Avenue in this case. And then we replanted this 700 feet of annuals with something that we could say was more sustainable, something that had a four-season quality, where they don't throw the plants away every year or give them away as they did, but they have really 4 seasons of beauty there. And there you can see the pattern being something much more gestural and large, and we got them to stop clipping the trees as gumballs and allowing them to grow the way lindens really grow. 200 lindens planted in 1971 and 1972, all still alive because of some very sophisticated detailing by the Sasaki firm. So now I'm describing a very different plaza which has been loved. Not all the time, but often. Just one other bit here, which is that those 2 garden paths have become, in recent years, a kind of excuse for the idea that the reflecting pool is too long and that it might ought to be cut in 2. This actually prompted what we now have in place as landmark status for the entire plaza. The idea was that they still don't like it after our interventions in public horticulture, and they would like it to be greener and more open and with fewer barriers. But that plan is not going to happen now. There was a plan of building a kind of bridge or cutting a path through the reflection pool. And so this is a case where original intention holds up beautifully, and where it was actually able to be used to prevent a kind of tampering with that, which I think we're all pretty grateful for. Just a couple of summary comments. We've recognized and moved on from the human tragedies that resulted from urban renewal in Boston. We don't do that anymore. But it's important to say that these 2 works, Boston City Hall and the Christian Science Plaza, arose from the eradication of depleted Boston neighborhoods as hopeful projects of renewal and redemption. Both were highly praised initially. The Christian Science Center has been continually acclaimed for its refinement and beauty, and now protected for that. It brought greater physical prominence to an institution that had helped alter the spiritual and social landscape of a conservative city, even if its own institutional leadership didn't always see it that way. More profoundly, it proved that design could successfully, though rarely, translate the traditional devices of monumentality and grand gesture into modernist forms of expression in renovating the city. The place is utterly memorable. The designers in this case achieved something few designers of the period could. Dramatic urban space that beautifully delivers on the tactics of monumental scale, distance, perspective, pause, and repose. While the aspirations of the other project's creators were similarly optimistic and, in their view, redemptive, the City Hall and its plaza suffered a different fate. Without any doubt, the lack of stewardship the city government has demonstrated for a long time, it's turning around now, has perpetuated the ill feelings that the public has had over a vast windswept plaza and a somber, poorly adapted building. And since our relationship to governing itself has been completely transformed over the 50 years of its existence, the forces gathering behind the need for significant change are much greater in this case. And so we feel justified in holding dearly to the aspirational parts of the original intentions, but more liberated when it comes to proposing very significant design interventions. So back to the plaza. For me, the reflecting pool remains the most essential ingredient in this dramatic space, a great singular act, astonishing in its length and breadth. It is the monumental placeholder, gathering everything around it in beautifully balanced tension. We all marvel at the cascading edge and the impression it creates of the water as a mysterious, solid body. A walk along the reflecting pool and the compulsion to move around it amounts to an act of respect for the edifices of the church and other surrounding buildings, and by extension, it's an act of respect for the city. Thank you.
Gary, thank you. That was excellent. Beautiful presentation. I want to welcome now Elizabeth Meyer to the podium. If you would like to start getting your questions ready on cards after hearing Gary's talk, and then follow up as Beth is speaking with other questions, we'll have more questions ready when we take them. Thank you.
Good evening. It's great to be back here where I first started practicing. Not only a place I love physically, but a lot of familiar faces in the audience. I'm going to start by asking, what does it mean to consider, to think carefully and to deliberate about a modernist urban landscape? And then why reconsider it? Are we reconsidering a place because it's significant to our culture? Are we thinking carefully about places? Again, because so many of them are unloved, uncared for, in disrepair? Are we concerned again because so many are threatened and their futures uncertain? This evening, Gary's introduced us to a couple of very interesting case studies. I'd like to now offer a broader set of definitions of modernist urban landscapes and why we should bother at all. And I'd like to start with 5 characteristics and then follow that up with a conundrum. So the first and most obvious, but not maybe the most important, is that I think we can date these landscapes from post-World War II up to the early 80s, and I would extend the time frame beyond what a modernist piece of art normally would be considered because of the long gestation for making landscapes. Many of them were conceived 10 years before they're actually built. Second, not everything built in that period is modernist. And I would say that we're looking today at landscapes that are conceived through the vocabulary, the principles, and the processes of abstract art and design. Garrett Ekbo in 1950 talked about the shared language of the modern arts: points, lines, planes, surfaces, and continuous flowing space. It's only after that shared vocabulary that different disciplines applied their medium. And for the spatial disciplines like landscape architecture and architecture, the free plan, the spatial emphasis of the free plan was an important part of these landscapes. So an implied interlocking volumetric space, not bounded by a room, but implied by points and planes and surfaces. And I know these are really washed out, but I can assure you that if you could look at the beautiful diagram on my screen, that you can tell the difference between a figure ground drawing on the right, which only shows tectonic built elements, and what it means to show tree trunks and tree canopies and the planted form of landscapes. As Gary mentioned, with Christian Science and with the interventions at the Boston City Hall Plaza that they're planning, planted form, the species, the spacing, the geometry, the arrangement of trees, of hedges, of shrubs, an incredible medium for creating the free plan, and it's been exploited since the 30s and the 40s in the work of people like James Rose and Garrett Ekbo and their classmate Daniel Kiley, who did so much work here in DC. The arrangement of these elements is an outgrowth of theories of functionalism as much as the visual arts. And so we see more asymmetries than symmetries in response to function, use, orientation, and sight. Another important quality and characteristic of this abstract medium is the way in which juxtaposition is used as an ordering device, and it could be the juxtaposition of materials or forms, textures or colors. This notion of juxtaposition, particularly when applied to the ground plane, was often an organizing device as well as a tactile attractor. So issues of rough and smooth, dry and wet, ephemeral and constant, in the amazing work of Pei and Kiley at the National Gallery would be examples of this. So two characteristics, time frame and abstraction. The third, and again, Gary's done a great job of introducing this, is that these are landscapes that were designed as part of projects that were responding to the processes of urbanization and modernization. They are landscapes within a political and a social context. So modernism relating to the issue of form and materials and arrangement, but modernization, which is not only the adoption of new technological processes and tools, but the social changes that are the result of that, and social changes that occurred because of the deployment of power and political agency. It's fair to say that the application of this power often led to social and political strife. And so these projects are caught up in the politics of not only interstate highways and urban renewal and displacement projects, but the power of individual developers as well. The fourth characteristic of this work is that it's being built on very unusual sites that landscape architects hadn't worked on much before. So you might think about work prior to 1960s, including a lot of greenfield development sites, suburbs, corporate headquarters, and campuses. But all of a sudden, we're looking at infill sites like Paley Park in New York City, tiny sites in contrast to what we were just looking at, right? The vast sites of urban renewal. Many of those urban renewal sites were large enough for multiple blocks and multiple plazas, and Halpern's work in Portland, a good example of this. These projects are also in what we now would call vague terrain, the interstitial space that's created when highways blast their way through cities, and Halpern's work in Seattle here, and another of his important projects with William Worcester on a new kind of site, a post-industrial site. This happened to be a chocolate factory in San Francisco. So landscape architects in the early 60s involved in adaptive use projects. So these sites are as fascinating as the strategies for working within them. The last characteristic of the work is that the designers were inventing through new typologies. And those typologies varied from festival marketplaces, like what we're looking at here, to playgrounds, pedestrian streets, like the one that is at the center of my hometown in Charlottesville, the plazas that Gary showed, which were not bounded like European cities, but actually semi-open and enclosed, and other kind of hybrid spaces like the Federal Housing Loan Bank project here, Liberty Plaza. There was both a plaza and a skating rink, or Mellon Plaza in Pittsburgh, a plaza and a parking garage. So this issue of hybridity, parks and plazas, like at Pershing Park, is another example of modernist landscapes. Now, the last quality that I want to share with you is actually a conundrum. And that is dealing with the social and experiential implications of modernist spatial ambiguity, or the free plan. I mean, at its best, and this is its best, 10 acres of Saarinen and Kiley in Columbus, Indiana, at a residential project. The free plan is a sensuous, somatic, sequential experience. It's a place of movement, strolling and walking for pleasure, and not just for need. But the free plan tests its limits of legibility at the scale of urban renewal, and Gary has alluded to this already. And so the qualities of space between trees and bosques and groves, the kind of qualities that you get from that kind of spatiality don't operate when the free plan is actually construed in the landscape as just openness, a tabletop or a carpet for an object building. Here, the result is not sensuous experience, but a sense of surveillance, of exposure, and of unease. So you can tell from Gary's account of Reed Hilderbrand's work altering Christian Science in Boston City Hall Plaza that the essential characteristics of a modernist urban landscape, their formal and their spatial logics, their social and their political context, their urban renewal sites, they can make these landscapes difficult to love. And I think the case studies we've looked at are valuable because they highlight many of the challenges and the need for creative approaches. I actually admire that Reed Hilderbrand's work avoids the question of whether to preserve or demolish and redesign. Instead, they explore how to respect the conceptual design intentions and the historic significance through additions and alterations that accommodate new socio-ecological needs and conditions. The projects make me think of this question. How can design on these sites be seen as a process of spatial and material adaptation that builds on the knowledge and the experience of both design history and environmental history, both of which are enmeshed in complex systems of thought and feedback loops? And frankly, I think we could, stop the conversation here tonight at that account of two remarkable projects and probably have a productive evening. But I'd like to step back and say a few words about why 1950s through 80s modernist urban landscapes are significant to 20th century culture and why they're worth reconsidering for that reason. In other words, I'd like to provide an overview beyond the biographies of talented men and women who've designed these spaces, as extraordinary as they were. The most important reason to value these landscapes is that they are a record of a particular historical context of American post-war modernization and urbanization. The result was not only displacement of minority populations, vast acreage of cleared land in the center of cities, but also large new landscapes and large new projects at scales that very few people had experienced designing. It's also happening during a period of extreme neglect, underinvestment in cities, lax environmental laws, and so the mega projects that ensued had a double obligation, not only to rebuild, but to rebuild within a culture of improving the environmental quality of our cities. This crisis was urgent enough that it called for a federal response, and many of you are familiar with that. The environmental regulations and preservation laws that came out of the late 60s. But guess what? Small urban open spaces were part of that initiative too. And they were attended to not only through guidelines and funding programs, but through presidential action. In February of 1965, President Johnson sent a message to Congress that discussed the need for federal involvement and assistance in improving urban life and urban open space. He wrote, "The increasing tempo of urbanization and growth is depriving many Americans of the right to live in decent surroundings. More of our people are crowding into cities and being cut off from nature. The modern technology, which has added so much to our lives, has a darker side. Its uncontrolled waste products are menacing the world we live in, our environment, and our health. The air we breathe, our water, our soil, and our wildlife are blighted by the poisons and chemicals which are the byproducts of technology and industry. The same society which receives the rewards of technology must take responsibility for control." Now, one of Johnson's initiatives in response to this message to Congress was his urban open space program that included matching grants for not only site acquisition, but for design and construction costs. He talked about the importance of public parks, realizing their full potential as sources of pleasure and play. And he discussed the effects of beauty and ugliness on the human psyche, the importance of natural beauty in new housing developments, and also the importance of historic preservation. I mean, it's so clear Lady Bird Johnson's voice is also throughout all of this text. Johnson follows this memo with a conference at the White House, 116 politicians, planners, designers, the White House Conference on Natural Beauty. And the topics of that event were quite extraordinary. Each topic had a report that was delivered at the conference in the state dining room of the White House. And they included things like urban open space, water and waterfronts, townscape, highways, underground utilities, automobile junkyards, etc. The participation in this event, in terms of landscape architects, and planners, was remarkable. I'll just mention a few of the landscape architects. They included Gerd Eckbo, Charles Eliot II, Larry Halprin, Ian McHarg, John Simon, Christopher Tunnard, Connie Worth, Deo Sasaki. And they gathered with senators, congressmen, and major policy experts. A few insights can be gleaned from this document, which I recommend reading. It's available online through the LBJ Library or Library of Congress. First, that American cities needed to be attended to not only in terms of environmental degradation, but the need for beauty. The second, that the discussion of the city was undergirded with a broad understanding of the landscape framework of American cities, a kind of dispersed pastoralism that dates back to L'Enfant, Penn, and Oglethorpe. Fritz Gutheim on the Kennedy's Advisory Council for Pennsylvania Avenue wrote in his report that the American city has a spacious quality and at best incorporates a natural framework and landscape pattern that runs into almost every block. This pattern of warp and woof of buildings in nature is most decisively expressed in shade trees. Landscape architecture wasn't the space between buildings. It was the landscape framework of the city itself. John Simons, in his report, talked about it not being enough to build parks in our cities, but we need to create our whole city as a park. We must rather conceive of each city as an interrelated park. So I bring up the White House Conference, this amazing 600-page document, quite aware of the landscape framework that was part of the federal city, but also quite aware of the present and future challenges. At the end of the event, when the reports were delivered, President Johnson said, "We must bring beauty into the daily lives of our people. All of us must draw strength from its presence." And then he went on to say that today, I worked and thought about problems in Vietnam and the Dominican Republic. I had to consider decisions that might affect the security of this country, of the lives of Americans, and the destiny of other nations. Yet, this may be the most important thing I have done and am doing today, for this is part of what all the rest is for. Crisis and conflict command the headlines, but it is your work that will shape the future. So yes, the other legacy of LBJ. The second reason that I think this work is significant is a little bit closer to home and maybe a little bit of inside ball. But this work is happening when the profession of landscape architecture is growing. Do you know, in 1949, there were 540 members of the ASLA in the United States. 540. In 1974, the professional organization had over 4,000 members. So this is an extraordinary growth period for landscape architecture. And a very small number of people were part of larger cohorts of planners, architects, and urban designers, making urban spaces and complexes at a large scale for the first time without the benefit of generations before them with much experience constructing cities and urban ecosystems. I think it's important to recognize this ambition and some of the failures that come from that. 20 years before ecologists ventured to talk about urban ecology and landscape ecology, and 30 years before the term landscape urbanism was coined. So there's a lot of experimentation, how to plant trees to get them to grow. Soil science and nursery standards were primitive. There's a lot of experimentation about social space. Why do people come together? What do they do there, right? So the Living Building program at GSA, that was a part of the Federal Home Loan Bank and Plaza project on Pennsylvania and 17th. The programming of cafes, incorporation of things like ice skating, Pennsylvania Avenues, amazing programming by the PADC over many years is part of that innovation. Incredible exploration of and innovation in material technology and the construction of not only pavements but integral drains. And the beginning, the beginning of codification of some of that knowledge. Henry Arnold, who worked for Dan Kiley, published Trees in Urban Design in 1980, one of the first times you could find case studies of what trees were in important public spaces, what species and arrangement they were, what was working and what wasn't. And this was particularly evident, and again, not so in the washed out light here, in the ways that the city planners in New York City were trying to figure out complex cross sections, and that in section is what they think a tree root looks like, right? So just a lot of misconceptions about urban systems. So I think it's not surprising, given all this experimentation, that a lot of projects have trouble, but it's also amazing the ones that succeeded, from big projects like Auditorium Forecourt to small projects like Paley Park. And I think given this period of creative destruction in American cities and the really small cohort of landscape architects who had any experience constructing cities, I think it's not surprising that some of the projects have failed technically or socially, or failed to be loved. I can say this personally, having spent 25 years teaching in this building with a really bad plaza designed by Sasaki on the north side of a brutalist building. But it does seem to me that it is important to think about some of the positive lessons from this period. And we're lucky in that the profession has already done this. In 1979, 14 years after the White House Conference, the Smithsonian's Museum in New York, the Cooper Hewitt, sponsored not only an exhibition, a conference, and a publication, but a multifaceted initiative called Urban Open Spaces. It included walking tours, film showings, outdoor performances, neighborhood improvement studies, a video production, 10 on-site exhibitions. And the call and the charge was essentially to understand where to find urban open spaces, to know more about how they affect us, and then learn how to protect them and to renew them, because they are our communal outdoor spaces. This remarkable newspaper, it had two formats, a little book and a big newspaper format, played three roles. One, it was a comprehensive summary of 2 decades of urban landscape design, and a pretty critical assessment of what wasn't working. The authors were amazing: Augie Heckscher, Wolf von Eckert, Halprin, Elizabeth Barlow, Paul Friedberg, Carl Lynn, J.B. Jackson. The book identified failures and work that still needed to be done, was really clear about the problems of the openness of the free plan. Peter Blake said that most of our urban spaces are seen to be designed for the convenience of architectural photographers. There are also problems of access, and this is because of, obviously, not only the section, but happening prior to universal access and human rights for those who are disabled and handicapped. And there's also a really strong section on the different social practices in Europe and the United States, and cultural traditions about using public space in the United States that were different from in other places. and references to the political tensions that happened after the race riots in the 60s. And it's worth thinking about that in the context of DC, where 1,200 buildings were burned in 1968, 6,000 arrested, 1,000 injured, and 12 people killed. And this event can't be understood just in relationship to Martin Luther King's death, but to a long history of marginalization in the city. So the authors talk about our plaza problem as being cultural, not just technological. They write, we build our plazas waiting for magic to happen, and it usually doesn't. We want to love them, and we usually don't. Concealed in the way we live, implied by even the briefest description of what causes us not to use plazas, is a sense of alienation from public experience. Because we have lost a part of this pleasure, our need to reclaim it is all the more real. And this phrase, the pleasure of public experience, I want to get back to. Last thing about this book is that it had an uncanny projection of future urban open space opportunities. They don't use the word tactical urbanism, but temporary uses. Elizabeth Barlow writes about urban wilds, and there's a lot about urban gardening as well. Now, I bet most of you don't know of this book, but you know of this one, written a year later, which added post-construction observation through film to our repertoire of how to understand better how people use public space. And regardless of how you feel about Holly White's work, and I see it limited to observations of white men from New York City in the 60s, his observation that people gathered where there was tree canopy, water, food, and other people is useful. But the food part can easily lead to spaces of consumption exclusivity. In my estimation, this book is much more important than White's. Taylor's authors are inclusive, political, and visionary, and I'm inspired by their collective assessment of what was important, what worked, and what needed improvement. I think this assessment and others related to more contemporary concerns like climate change, sustainability, urban metabolism, can guide our decisions about how to alter and modify and change these important 20th century modernist landscapes. So again, why bother, and why does this matter, and what is my stake in this? I've had the pleasure of spending time in a great modernist urban landscape in Charlottesville, and as I mentioned before, a not so great one in Charlottesville. But I also know what it's like to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue and 8th Street when it's full of vacant buildings and it smelled of mildew. So I've seen the transformation that occurred with these very spaces that we're talking about. I've also been involved in these issues for 20 years, and the first assessment of preservation for modern landscape architecture occurred in 1999 in a symposium organized by the National Park Service. In addition, I've seen in design competitions for projects like the St. Louis Arch Grounds the importance of understanding the complexity of these landscapes. And then more recently, in the last 4.5 years, through CFA Design Review, have begun to appreciate how frequently this kind of project comes for public review. My experience as a citizen activist and on design review boards is that projects often start with no recognition that the design landscape matters. It's as if these places weren't even designed, that somehow the context emerged through self-organization. There's very little understanding of design history, and when projects are described, they're described as an aggregation of stuff, with no understanding of how they're arranged and the role of space. Spatial organization, material arrangement and affect, social aspirations, and the urban design and social history are ignored. And this results in frustrating and cumbersome design reviews and less inspired results. So there's still much to be done. And I want to talk about a couple of ways to move forward. Beyond research, and there's still a lot of history that needs to be written, towards new modes of practice. The first thing I'd like to propose is that next practices for adapting modernist landscapes should take into consideration the significant role that they've played in responding to and giving form to national urban policies about urban space and programs, as well as specific urban histories of urban displacement and renewal. The second is to recognize the sensuous experiences of everyday life that are afforded by many of the best modernist urban landscapes. And these range from the experience of comfort to risk and adventure. The third is to understand that some of the intrinsic qualities of these spaces have led to their decline or failures. Material innovation, spatial ambiguity, the lack of maintenance, the vulnerability of these landscapes to change in adjacent parcels, which can alter scale, as Gary mentioned with the Boston project, microclimate, circulation patterns. And this is a much bigger problem for landscapes than for architecture. And then lastly, the fact that landscapes are part of larger networks. Fourth, I'd like to recognize that current challenges are also important to consider, especially climate change, with extreme weather events and water scarcity or deluge. These require modifications. These are not ways of destroying a modernist landscape. We would not expect a 1950s or 60s building to be using the same HVAC system today that it had then. Fifth, I'd like us to embrace the fact that adapting modernist landscapes does not require demolition and redesign, that there are many approaches and tactics between them. These projects are going to deserve and require the same consideration that Elizabeth Barlow Rogers, Phil Winslow, Bruce Kelly, and Tony Walmsley brought to the 19th century urban park in the 1970s. The key will be spatial logics, material intelligence, and keen skills in sight reading and interpretation, as demonstrated in Reed Hilderbrand's work, a firm known as excellent designers and not experts in historic preservation. This is not easy because it's very hard to find the line between adaptation and destruction, and I realize that. But I prefer tactics of addition and adaptation to rehabilitation, bringing something back to its former condition, for many reasons, if not one in particular. The Secretary of Interior standards and its focus on landscape elements as separate systems is not commensurate to what I would call the contemporary non-human turn, the desire to think about the social and the ecological as a hybrid condition and not a separate one. So we have much to change and to talk about, not just the projects, but the standards that we're abiding by, the curriculum that we teach. Public officials need to understand the importance of maintenance and to make the case for this, and to realize that thoughtful changes can occur versus whole-scale demolition and change. I'm going to end one more time saying, why bother? And I'm showing a renovation era photo of Halperin's Auditorium forecourt in Portland. In 1979, in Urban Open Spaces, Larry Halperin wrote an essay called The Collective Perception of Cities. And he talked about the importance of these places where we encounter each other, where we meet and enjoy and participate in that communal life we call the city. Modernist urban landscapes, parks and plazas and streets, are where we encounter human and non-human others through contestation, appropriation, and celebration. The pleasure of urban experiences brings us together. It entangles our bodies with materials and systems. This generation's experiments in living and building, their optimism and their self-criticism, offer models and cautionary tales for thinking, analyzing, making, and acting for our generation when identity politics has superseded community and a sense of belonging. Why bother with the pleasure of urban open space? Because a sense of who and what constitutes the public rests not only in our political contracts, but on those effective experiences and communal bonds that unfold unwittingly, inadvertently, in urban public spaces through encounters with others. And that's why I bother. Thanks.
What I want to start with is what some things you were alluding to, Beth. We need consensus, I guess, about some of these things, or at least a consensus about where we can depart from consensus in dealing with modern landscape and its future. And I'm wondering, you mentioned the standards that we do have. I think you were probably talking about the national park standards and the DOI. What can we do besides that? They scarcely seem sufficient anymore for all the conditions and all the permutations we're looking at today. Mm-hmm. And they don't apply to a lot of projects.
We could spend a lot of time talking about this. So I'll just say that everyone I know who worked on those initially assumed that they'd be updated more frequently. And so I think that's just an important conversation that needs to happen. But short of that, I think it's really useful to have case studies like the ones that Reed Hilderbrand are doing that actually push a little bit. Yeah. And I mean, similarly, at the St. Louis Arch Grounds, when NBVA's team couldn't get permission to do some of the soil replacement that we wanted because of the fact that the soil was so bad, construction fill, they got really inventive and used fracking radishes, yes, right, to break up the soil. And
ingenious.
So I feel like, there's kind of two ways to go. One are the practitioners finding ways to talk about strategic alterations and to be very clear about those insertions or inlays or laminates. I think I often use terms that are almost architecture terms to begin to think about the limited nature of these. And then I think it's important for those who are in the public sector to also begin to think about ways that we can get together to start finding the next version of this. My concern is if we don't, we end up with pickling, I love that term, I hadn't thought about it, pickled projects that don't work anymore. Right. The microclimates don't work, the social context has changed, or we're actually just being really bad stewards because in many ways preservation is the first thing that a sustainable designer or planner should do, which is to care about the embodied energy that's in those projects and not simply haul it away.
Yeah. So to what degree should someone who's in charge of a public space, a beloved public space, an important public space, keep an open mind versus a fresh perspective to get a fresh perspective versus this sort of doctrinaire, let's just keep it what it was? Because obviously, Gary, you were successful in making alterations to Christian Science Plaza, and I hope will be in Boston City Hall.
Yeah. Modest ones in the case of Christian Science Plaza and very ambitious ones in the case of City Hall and City Hall Plaza. I would have to agree with Beth that the achievement, we can't underestimate the achievement of getting those standards in place when it happened. That was a really important thing because until then we had nothing in a sense. But I too feel, as so many do, that those standards have to evolve. And I would say, in short, that Beth has in a way, laid out a way of thinking about revisionist thinking on those standards. Things that are much more vital now, given that we have soil science, that we understand drainage very differently, that we have to capture water, that we have to protect landscapes from climate turbulence.
Right.
And we just know a lot more. So those standards need to evolve. But your question is difficult because I would like to say that clients ought to have an open mind and they ought to listen to their designers. But they're not always getting the best advice. And you know, it's hard not to get to a place where one says, you know, just make sure you get really good designers who are willing to dig deeply, to think deeply, to go beyond what's asked for in the Secretary of Interior standards, and maybe not have not be bounded by methodologies, but be empowered by knowledge.
So a lot of what we talked about this afternoon boiled down to the simple fact of maintenance. So standards aside, we're going to assume there are no standards involved. If a designer is retained to return to an important site, they have a responsibility to do that in a maintenance forward kind of way, correct?
Yes.
I mean, is that just done now, or because a lot of these things are blamed on a lack of love for spaces. In particular, I think that's the case at Pershing Park. It was the case at PV Plaza, another Friedberg project in Minneapolis. But, you know, it's also the case at Franklin Square here in Washington, which is going to be redone, I presume, very lovingly by the firm Olin. But no one has suggested that we upend Franklin Park.
Right.
And why is that? Is it special?
I'm not sure about Franklin Park. I mean, Franklin Park is such a complex system. I'm sorry, are you talking about Franklin Park in Boston?
I'm sorry, Franklin Park in Washington.
I
It
can't-
is a mess,
Can't
I will
speak
tell
about
you
it.
though.
I can speak about Franklin Park in Boston.
That seems like a sidebar from your first question about
Maintenance.
management and maintenance.
Yeah. So the maintenance aspect, we have a
Yeah.
responsibility. We can't,
Yeah.
there's this common pattern where landscapes fail, and it's usually because maintenance has not been performed. So what do we do about that problem versus saying this was just a bad project to begin with?
So I think it's important to realize that there's a couple of maintenance issues with modernist landscapes. One is that new technologies they're new, right? So some things just didn't work well. And I remember talking to some of the brick manufacturers when the city of Charlottesville replaced 376,000 bricks in the Halperin Mall instead of hiring a mason for a few years. And the guy at Endicott Brick was saying, you know, I bet you what they did was this installation technology that was a bad idea. And it turns out they did. They spread stone dust, the mortar dry. They hosed it down, and they placed the bricks on top. That was the technique that was being used in '75.
Yeah.
So, you know, part of it is just recognizing that some of the technologies were not tested, and that's a vulnerability that a lot of buildings and landscapes of this period have. The second is the mythology that there is such a thing as a maintenance-free landscape. They
Correct.
do not exist.
Nope.
And we would never assume that this marvelous building doesn't need to be cleaned and its mechanical systems serviced. We would never do that, but we somehow assume that a landscape doesn't need those things.
It can be extreme. The concern about maintenance can be extreme. We're working in Tampa, Florida, which is a city I've come to really like. And there was an important Kylie landscape there, a project with Harry Wolff, which deteriorated rather quickly for the reasons that Beth is citing. Just, you know, not a good sense of technology at the time. And the plants failed because there was no soil science and there wasn't enough water, and the systems broke down and they weren't fixed. And a lot of other things failed too. What's shocking to me, though, is that the city has essentially rebuilt the project, but without the trees.
Without trees.
Without the trees. And they now call it Kiley Park.
Wow.
It's truly shocking because it's workable. You can plant trees in that environment if you go the distance. And so I think it's an important concern for sure. I think we're not always good experts at it. We work with somebody who really is, and we try to have them on our team. But I think there's, in some cases, really a mania about it, and it smothers the ambition.
Yeah. Well, before I move on, I'm going to move on to the questions next from the audience. But real quick, let me refine that point a little bit. Are we talking about the failures of plantings in particular in modernist landscapes? As we saw today, they weren't very good at Banneker Park. Is this because they're built on structure and not in more generous ground? Or is that too simplistic a reason? I mean, like Olmsted, did they have soil science in the making of Central Park, Prospect Park, Lincoln, or Jackson?
I think one difference that Beth has really pointed out, perhaps not without saying it exactly this way, is that we're talking about planting trees in systems with paving.
Right.
And Olmsted didn't really do that.
Right. Okay.
Right? So
this is a key difference.
Olmsted
today.
planted in what I will call horticultural soil.
Yeah.
They understood plant needs for nutrient cycling and so on. What the modernists tried to do was to rebuild the field condition of the city, the surface of the city, but grow trees the way we like to see trees, mature and giving us shade and giving us all the comforts, that Beth, all the experiential qualities that Beth has spoken about tonight. But they didn't get it right. More often than not, they didn't get it right. And the issues are around the volume of soil that's available for the root mass of a tree. We like to get about 1,000 cubic feet or more per tree. It's about soil moisture. And, we were looking at where willow oaks have declined or even died and been replaced on Pennsylvania Avenue, and where the replacement trees are struggling. Well, I think that's because there's been root death and essentially a condition where there's no soil biology left in the soil that's below the sidewalk where these trees eventually have to grow. And without that, the trees can't survive. So I think these matters of soil science in particular, and urban forestry more generally, have now given us ways of rethinking that. But it was a very immature thing 40 and 50 years ago, even 30 years ago.
Right. Okay, I'm going to go to the first question from the audience. Thank you. All right, surrounding architecture is very much part of the contextual framework. How might future development respond to the scale and gestures of these designs without undermining their original intent, i.e. the scale of waterfront development adjacent to Banneker Overlook?
Well, I keep going back to Gary's image of that little government building from 1713 in Boston, right? Not everything that's monumental when it's built is going to be monumental in the future. And Banneker, I think, was extraordinary in relationship not to its immediate site, but that probably 10-mile vista down the river, right, towards Jones Point. So that's gone now. But when we were inside Banneker Overlook at the center, because of the beautiful way that it's graded and the height of the perimeter walls, even with the fountain not working, you could barely hear the freeway. And so I actually think that, the future of that is by recognizing it as an extraordinary space that has interiority and not being an overlook. I think you have to actually kind of flip that, because it can't gain the vastness of that long vista. Can't regain it.
Yeah. And that was a surprise loss to some people on the trip today, was that this new building that I believe, well, the developer shall remain nameless, but it was supposed to provide a vista down straight through the river. It's about 3 stories too high to do that.
You'd have to be
now.
very tall to see that vista today.
Oops. Okay, next question. Consider the critical difference between Christian Science Center and City Hall Plaza. One is privately owned and maintained, the other public. If, unlike in Paris, for example, we have so little regard for truly public space, how can we possibly hope to make and keep public space truly public? Will the new City Hall Plaza fall apart like the existing one?
Ooh. Let's hope not. I think the conditions are really radically changed. It's really an astute observation that the Christian Science Plaza has been incredibly well maintained by its owners. The great act that church leadership made, the generous act that they performed, was to take 14 acres and make it public, but keep it in their private hands and maintain it. And so that's not the reason why we should go very carefully there. I think that the strength of the design and I would say an almost continuous passion around that design by the leadership and really by the design community at least, has worked in tandem with the fact that they've kept it up. It's costing them too much, and now they're developing around it, and this part of the city really can use more density. And so I think that some very good decisions have been made to create a tower on their property, which will pay back into the fund that maintains the plaza. And so that, will the city of Boston take care of the landscape it builds? This is an unanswerable question. But I do think we're in a different time. And the city has made a vast commitment to the project. There's a budget that's protected. It's a good one. And so I just want to be optimistic and hopeful about it.
All right.
Can I answer that in a slightly different way? Because those two projects can be understood in relationship to a continuum of management policies and practices. But I think actually their publicness is more in relationship to the continuum, not of maintenance, but of social management, right? And I think that's the real conundrum for public space today, right? Benches on Pennsylvania Avenue or on the Halpern Mall in Charlottesville disappearing because somehow we can't abide to be in a space with someone less fortunate than us who might be living on the street. So this issue of management regimes is very, I think, important. The deal that's struck when there's business improvement districts is that a place is less public. It's got security. There are things you can and cannot do. And I think about Henri Lefebvre's description of public space is that it's a place that can be appropriated. And that doesn't mean you can build your own house there, but it sure means you can move a chair or a bench if you want to, or actually make it your own for a while. And so I think that's a big challenge as these places are reimagined, is thinking not only about maintenance, but management of activity and interaction and behavior.
Okay, we have to wrap up, I'm notified. I hope you all enjoyed this as much as I did. I want to thank our panelists.
Thank you.
Beth and Gary, thank you very much. Thanks again to NCPC and the National Building Museum, and thank you all for coming.